So now we're going to look at some techniques with the left hand, although I didn't call it just left hand technique because we're also going to show how to do it right hand also with tapping. But for the most part, hammer-ons and pull-offs are the main focus of this. So they form a pretty important part of a lot of metal music where you're transitioning between notes without necessarily having to pick them and make that sort of sound, where it's a bit more staccato and forced, kind of like you're strictly sticking to a tempo. With a hammer-on pull-off, first off, it gives you the ability to go a little faster, but it also sounds smoother. So it's a pretty big part of the sound a lot of times. So once you're confident with the idea of hitting a note with precision and power almost, putting your finger on the fret, not passively, not just sort of barely hitting it with the tip, but actually having a full force instead of just sort of getting to it and then passively playing it, then with more practice and more left hand strength, a hammer-on, in my opinion, can come pretty naturally. A hammer-on just means going to the fret and pushing down on it with the left hand instead of using the right hand to actually make the vibration. So when you're practicing on an acoustic guitar or not plugged in, at first it sounds really rough. It sounds like a lot of almost scratching, or just the sound of the string hitting the fret, more so than the string actually vibrating to the right of the fret. So it is a good idea to practice these while plugged in, while running through a high gain amp or distortion and everything. A good place to start is with hitting an open note and then doing one hammer-on. In essence, all you're doing is getting to the position where you would be playing that second note, and just being ready and hitting down. It's funny because there isn't that much different of a technique for a hammer-on, aside from that you have to maybe be more deliberate in coming from above to sort of make sure you're not hitting the next string below it on the way. You don't want to also hit that. But you also don't want to go too high because then you're using the tip, which can be pretty awkward and not really work well for moving around. So if you have the finger in the right place, then it can come pretty naturally, and it's more just a matter of synchronizing your timing between right and left hand. So in principle then, just doing one hammer-on like that is actually pretty straightforward, or at least it's not very different from just picking a note in the start. It's really just the timing aspect. And in particular, that example is pretty easy for putting power or strength into the actual hitting down. So it's not too much a concern that the string has to vibrate after you hit it with your left hand, because as long as you hit it, with medium force, it'll probably do that. The ones that are trickier are when you have to kind of come up with the force all to itself with, let's say you're already playing a note that's on a fret and then you go up one. With that, if you just hit down, then because your hand is already in a more of an awkward position to start with, you can't really go down with your preferred finger. You have to, use another finger and then also, come at that angle. So you can't go completely straight like this. You have to kind of train yourself over time to come at it from this almost diagonal angle. In certain pieces, you'll come up with all kinds of weird ways of sort of rotating your hand just so you can reach the right combination. So be sure to remember that you're not really trying to use the exact same motion you would when picking it, but that you're actually trying to put power on it. Otherwise, it might have more of a weak sound. If you just move your finger down, then you might not get the full sound. So by all means, use a setting with high gain, use a lot of distortion to help out, especially when you're just starting out, to make sure that you know that you can hear the feedback of whether you're hitting it right or not. You know that if you kind of miss it, then you're not, it's not ringing out afterwards. Then you know you're doing something wrong, but if you hear it keep playing afterward, then you know you did it right. Now a pull-off is a bit trickier in my opinion, because especially if you look at it technically what is actually happening, it looks like you have to do a pretty complicated procedure almost. Theoretically, what you're doing is after a note is played with the finger on a fret, then you actually let go, but not just let go, you play a note with the left hand. And that can be pretty tricky, especially if you are, say, doing a pull-off between only a gap of one fret, because at that point you don't have very much leverage on the string. It's not like, let's say you're in the very middle of the string, then it's pretty easy to move the string around. And so if that's really what you're doing and almost plucking with your left hand, then it would be fairly easy. So in looking at it that way, it might seem like it's pretty difficult to do a pull-off just between the 8th and 7th fret here. In reality though, you don't have to work too much at actually pulling it like in a plucking motion. I see it more as you're relying on the energy that's already there from the string already vibrating, and just being really precise in the movement of when you choose to pull it off. You're not literally pulling off. If you do that, the sound might be a bit weaker. So what I do is I pull downwards a little bit as it's coming off, so that way the very tip of my finger is slightly playing the note. That's pretty exaggerated just for demonstration. In practice it might be more like this. So it's a smooth motion, almost diagonally out. And you'll notice it actually doesn't work if you just start like that. If you were to be very rigorous and training your fingers really well, you might try doing it without having picked the note first. That should just be more of an exercise though than an actual expectation of how to play, because having the vibration already there is really helpful. And combining the two, you can do a series of hammer-ons and pull-offs, which might get increasingly difficult as you're doing more and more of them, because then you're not relying on the initial energy of the string being picked anymore. So in that example, you actually do have to rely on hitting and pulling the string in such a way that it's actually causing more vibration as opposed to just letting it wear off. So that's kind of letting it wear off. So with that, just having a sort of a fast consecutive motion actually helps. Doing it slower, oddly enough, makes it more difficult, because then there's less times when you're putting energy into the string. I don't know if that's a completely accurate description on a technical level, but that's kind of how it is in my experience, because it is fairly easy, I think, to do a trill where you're not even sticking to any timing, you're just quickly moving up and down. Because in that case, you don't have to think too much about the technique in each one. It gets pretty tedious or difficult doing it that way, whereas if you just are quickly moving the finger up and down, as opposed to doing a full cyclical motion, then it comes a bit more naturally. So this really does enable you to play faster once you get the hang of it, because then you can put all your efforts on the timing of the notes that are picked. Now, some might think it's crazy to cover tapping in intro lesson, but I think that it is actually a helpful concept to talk about and practice and to master your skills on the strings and, you know, controlling it even with high gain settings like you have in metal. So yeah, I think it's a fun thing to practice, even if you don't put it into a song early or do a tapping solo as you're starting out. I mean, even as I was just getting started, I would do tapping as a way of trying to see the most solo-like thing I could play at the time, and it just became a fun way of practicing, much easier in my opinion than sweep picking or some other kind of solo techniques, picking multiple strings in an awkward pattern to me. Essentially, with your right hand, you're just doing hammer-ons and pull-offs. It's that simple as a description of, you know, what the definition is. But of course, because you're coming at it from a different angle, you're using your right hand, then you have to practice the coordination all over again. So for that reason, that's why I like covering it kind of in the same area as hammer-ons and pull-offs. So the coordination can be very difficult to do something that's more than just a back and forth. If you have, you know, 3, 4, 5 notes that you're doing in sequence, then you actually have to be moving different fingers on the left hand on and off just to prepare for the next note, let alone actually playing it. So for that reason, just to start off, we'll look at just a 2-note back and forth. So in this example, the hammer-on is just using a similar technique as the left hand, except that it's a little bit more on the inside of the finger just because of the angle of approach. You can't really get it like that. You can't really point your finger parallel to the fretboard. It normally comes a bit farther from above just because of how you're holding the instrument. And then the pull-off is a bit trickier in my opinion. You know, I see the hammer-on as just doing the same thing as a left hand, but a pull-off is more of a pushing motion, so that's a new thing to learn about and practice. If you were to practice just doing the pull-off portion, then make sure you're making a sound like doing that. With 3 fingers, then the left hand, in my opinion, is doing something a lot more complicated, which is sort of funny because if you're not familiar with guitar and you're just a fan and you go to a concert and you see someone doing a solo, and the minute they start tapping, it just, in my opinion, it visually looks more like they're showing off or they're doing a crazy technique, whereas sometimes what the left hand is doing is actually trickier as far as timing coordination. So a 3-note technique involves doing a pull-off onto one of these other fingers and then pulling off there as well. So it's 2 pull-offs in a row. What's difficult about that, or the most difficult in my opinion, is putting this other finger back in position while this finger is down again. So it's not just 3 notes and then repeat, because at this point if you just repeat, then this finger is up and you need the finger to be down again later, but you can't put it down while this note's still ringing out. You have to wait until that note is down again, but it has to come down again before you let go. So at some point while this note is playing, you bring it down. So it would not be like this, or at least that's a different part, and it would not be too late like this. You have to make sure it's coming down while the note is playing out. in my opinion, because with the right hand is more straightforward. It's kind of on the on beat in that example. The trick is doing a weird sort of off time pattern with this finger. So let's look at a different pattern that still uses 3 notes. This would be a repeating unit of 4 notes played among these 3. What I mean by that is depending on how your brain is wired or how you do with triplets and 3/4 time, this actually might be easier because you don't have to worry about this series of 3. In this, the left hand does not have to come on during that awkward period when one note is playing. It actually comes on time. So the whole part is just divided into 4 equal sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Once you get the hang of this all, then it can be pretty fun to make variations that are not actually that different, but make it sound like you're playing something really fancy. Now it's important not to leave out the previous concept of playing clean. So that can be tricky when you lose the ability to mute with your right hand in the same way. Instead you have to do it again, but sort of more towards the middle of the fretboard, where you can't do it like a palm mute. If you push down, then it makes noise right there. So you have to be more careful about sort of resting on it. In practice, what I normally do is I actually let the hand push down and just make sure I'm not doing the actual pushing down to the frets at a time when it would make sound. So let's say I'm playing something else, and then it's time to do tapping. If I do that timing right, ideally I hit the new note at the same time or slightly before, muting the notes with my right hand as well, because that way it's a new just played note that'll overpower the sound of hitting the string against the fretboard. Whereas if I do it before, either I mute it or I make sound before the new note, so then there's an awkward gap there. And if I do it too late, you have this extra noise still from having let go of this string down here. So I'm not going to really dive into slides all that much, but I should point out that using a slide is in some cases actually equivalent to a hammer-on pull-off if the riff structure suits that. What I mean by that is just doing a slide between 2 frets right next to each other is sometimes what you actually do when the part makes it difficult to use multiple fingers for those 2 notes. So it can be useful to practice doing that, maybe between 2 frets or between 3 frets. It's a good way of practicing control over the instrument, and at each point making sure that you're muting these strings up here without moving your finger over too much this way to accidentally be rubbing against these strings on the way down. And it's also very good for muscle memory as far as knowing where each fret is, at least stored in your hand's memory. You don't have to consciously move to the fret and think, okay, I'm going to move my hand this far over. You can just kind of look at it and your hand does the work for you once you've practiced enough. So as you can see, sometimes the hammer-on, pull-off, and slide kind of merge into one thing. So they do have their own texture and feel, each of them, but when you're playing a faster part, sometimes it's almost too difficult to distinguish. It just depends on whether you want to have that sound of picking or not. But on the left hand, whether it's a slide or a hammer-on pull-off, they kind of just have that same smooth feel because you're just using your fingertips instead of a pick. So once you have in fact gotten to a point where you can consistently play hammer-ons and pull-offs with just your left hand, then at that point you're free to be a bit more creative with whatever you're doing with your right hand. You can use it to help out, either with some unexpected tapping or to even just change the meaning of what a hammer-on pull-off is and pull off to something else. So one of my favorite songs actually goes a bit like this. And at that point, you don't have to worry about doing a technique with the other hand. It's just a matter of holding something in place, almost like a capo. It's just there so that you can do whatever else you want. Except, of course, it's not really the best hold, so you can just go for the actual note. And you can also work just a little bit of tapping into something else you're already playing.